On the evening of September 21st, 2025 at 1930 Moscow time, a routine night at the Foros sanatorium in Crimea turned into a political earthquake. Lights flashed, alarms screamed, explosions ripped through a compound long linked to the Russian elite. Moscow later confirmed casualties and several damaged buildings. This was not an ordinary strike. The blast landed inside territory Moscow claims to control, and it sent a message that reverberated far beyond broken glass. Was this a symbolic hit meant to humiliate, or a new kind of strike that changes who can claim the night over the Black Sea? The answer will shape how both sides count risk and how far Ukraine will push tools that are small in price but large in effect. First, we must understand what Foros is and why hitting it matters in political and symbolic terms. Foros Sanatorium is not just a hotel on the Black Sea coast. It is a landmark tied to power, secrecy, and the Russian state. Built in 1989 during the last years of the Soviet Union, it became famous because Mikhail Gorbachev was held there under house arrest during the failed coup of August 1991. That event marked the end of Soviet rule and the start of a new political map in Eastern Europe. From that time forward, Foros has been linked with turning points in Russian history. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Foros Sanatorium changed its role. Instead of being only a state-run health retreat, it became a gathering place for senior officials, wealthy businessmen, and figures close to the Kremlin. Russian media has often described it as part of a network of elite resorts in Crimea, where leaders could meet in private and relax far from public view. Its connection to state dachas in the same area made it more than a holiday site. It became a secure zone where political and intelligence decisions were often prepared away from Moscow. The compound itself has symbolic weight because of its location and design. It sits close to the Foros cliffs, overlooking the Black Sea, and is surrounded by several state-owned villas used by Russian ministries and the Federal Security Service. To strike here is to touch a cluster of places where Russian elites gather and where security agencies have their presence. The physical closeness of luxury and state power turns this area into a target with political meaning far greater than its size on the map. Foros is also tied to the culture of privilege that defines Moscow's ruling class. Banquets under its glass roof, private garages filled with armored cars, and halls decorated for closed meetings all reflect the image of untouchable comfort. These details mattered when the attack came. Reports described explosions that shattered the roof of the main hall, fire that consumed a VIP Mercedes, and structural damage to kitchens and western walls. Those scenes carried a message. The safe world of the powerful can be broken apart in seconds. Independent analysts use satellite images to show heavy fire damage to parts of the compound, though the full scale of destruction could not be verified immediately. The Russian-installed authorities in Crimea admitted that at least 3 people died and more than 15 were wounded. That admission was unusual because Moscow often tries to minimize reports of successful Ukrainian strikes. The numbers may not tell the whole story, since outside groups have not been able to confirm the exact toll, but even Russian confirmation shows that the incident was too visible to deny. The choice of target forced Moscow to face embarrassment, and the admission itself highlighted the political cost. In the wider war, hitting Foros was more than a random blow. Ukraine has aimed at airfields, fuel depots, and ports across Crimea, but this strike cut into a different layer of Russia's control: the social and political symbols of rule. By choosing a site tied to leisure, planning, and prestige, Ukraine showed that its reach goes beyond purely military facilities. It signaled that even the inner circle of the Russian system cannot feel secure on occupied territory. For Western observers, this underlined the idea that Russia's power in Crimea rests on fragile ground. There is also a strong psychological factor in attacking such a location. For many Russians, Crimea has been sold as ours forever since the 2014 annexation. Striking a luxury sanatorium connected to the state shows that the Fortress Crimea narrative is no longer convincing. The event exposed not only weaknesses in defense, but also the vulnerability of elites who depend on Crimea for privacy and prestige. That is why, in the hours after the blasts, Russian social media was filled with questions about how drones could reach such a sensitive site without being stopped. For Ukrainians and their supporters, the strike was an act of symbolic justice. It turned a place of privilege into a battlefield and reminded the world that Crimea remains contested. In a war where resources are uneven, targeting symbols can shift morale as much as targeting weapons. With the symbolic weight of Foros clear, the focus now turns to the tools and tactics Ukraine is reported to have used to deliver the strike on that September night. The strike on Foros was not a single bomber run. It was a layered attack built from low-cost, networked tools that work together. At the center of that approach was the Magura family of unmanned surface vessels, which Ukraine and private developers have promoted as sea drones able to carry payloads or act as launch platforms for smaller attack drones. These vessel-class drones have been shown in action across the Black Sea and discussed widely in defense reporting. Public demonstrations and battlefield footage have made the Magura name a practical reality rather than a concept. One version reported in open sources is called the Magura V5. It is a long, low-profile boat-like drone designed to run quietly at sea and carry either explosives or smaller unmanned aerial vehicles. In operations, the drone mothership tactic looks simple. The Magura runs out of range, opens a bay, and releases several first-person view attack drones. The vessel then withdraws to sea and blurs back into the traffic of ships and fishing boats. That tactic forces defenders to contend with threats coming from waterlines rather than traditional air corridors. The attacking aerial elements in this case were reportedly small FPV drones of the OSA family. FPV attack drones are compact, fast, and built to strike by impact. They carry shaped charge or high explosive loads and steer directly into targets under pilot control. They fly low, often skimming the sea or hugging cliff faces, which keeps them in radar blind spots and makes them hard to track with conventional air defense radars. These machines cost hundreds to a few $1,000s each, but their warheads can punch through glass, light armor, and thin concrete when they hit at high speed. Field reporting and technical write-ups have shown how FPV systems give small teams precision at short range while remaining cheap enough to mass. What turned a handful of drones into a military problem was the combined tactic. According to available reporting and the operational patterns seen across recent Ukrainian strikes, the Magura or similar vessel releases a decoy element first. That lead device disperses chaff or creates a large false radar return to mimic a big target, while the true attack drones slip into radar shadows beside cliffs or under coastal clutter. This ghost chain method makes the enemy see a single large threat and commit expensive interceptors, while the real swarm squeezes through the gaps. The technique pairs physical deception with electronic measures to force a mismatch between what defenders perceive and what is real. Ukraine's pattern also mixes tactics: suicide drones, piloted FPV strikes, electronic warfare, and low-cost maritime platforms. Kyiv has scaled FPV production rapidly and plans to buy millions more small drones to sustain pressure. That scale matters because defenders cannot afford to treat each drone as a unique, high-value target. They must choose which threats to shoot and which to let pass, and that choice creates openings attackers can exploit. Reuters reporting estimates Ukraine's planned purchases and growing domestic production as part of a deliberate industrial strategy to turn drones into a mass weapon. It is important to note limits in the open record. Some technical details come from battlefield footage, trade show material, or company papers rather than from independent military confirmation. Other elements are described in battlefield transcripts and eyewitness accounts that combine fact and narrative. Where the transcript you supplied gives fine tactical timings and cinematic details, open-source reporting confirms the broader pattern. Sea drones exist, FPV attacks have been used, and swarms plus decoys have become a recognized threat. Still, precise weights, angles of impact, and some sequence details may be contested until independent forensic analysis is published. The consequence is clear. These systems change the cost calculus of war. For attackers, a few $100s of kit can force a defender to expend millions in interceptors or risk political embarrassment. For defenders, expensive integrated systems must now address a flood of low-cost, hard-to-detect threats, which strains logistics, training, and the rules that govern when to fire. That tension drives a new kind of arms race where nimble production and creative tactics can offset heavier hardware, at least for targeted, high-value symbolic strikes. Having outlined the tools and how they work in concert, we now walk through the night's timeline to see how Russian defenses reacted and where those systems failed or were outwitted. The attack unfolded step by step, and each moment showed how small machines could create big problems for a heavily armed state. At 1931 local time, a Magura vessel stopped about 3 miles offshore. Its bay doors opened, and 6 OSA FPV drones slipped into the water and then rose to skim the surface. They began their run toward the Foros cliffs. The mothership turned back into the night, leaving the smaller craft to complete the job. The first move was deception. One drone released a cloud of aluminum strips, creating dozens of false radar echoes. Russian operators saw the mass as one large target, not 6. As the decoy gained attention, the others hugged the base of the cliffs, staying low in the radar shadows. This tactic has been noted in earlier Ukrainian strikes, where cheap decoys forced Russia to waste valuable interceptors. By 1932, weather became a factor. A sudden gust struck one drone, the one already weakened by a corroded antenna. It began to lose stability, and the pilot in Odessa had to fight to keep it on course. The image of a soldier sweating over the controls hundreds of miles away underlines the human pressure behind these machines. On shore, Russian patrols were scanning the cliffs. A Spetsnaz operator spotted a heat signature and used an electronic rifle, known as a drone gun, to fry the circuits of the decoy. Sparks fell into the sea, giving Russia its first kill. The success was short-lived. The real swarm was already slipping under the radar curtain. Moments later, air defense units reacted. A Pantsir S-1 battery near Yalta lit up its screens, and a Su-30 fighter jet scrambled from a nearby airfield. Both were designed to destroy targets many times larger and faster than hobby-sized drones. Yet they had no choice but to respond. One Pantsir missile, worth millions, shot into the aluminum chaff cloud and exploded in the empty air. For Russian commanders, it looked like a victory. In reality, they had just wasted an expensive round on nothing. By 1933, chaos spread across the network. The Su-30 pilot faced multiple small blips at different altitudes. The drones climbed, dived, and split formation, making it impossible to engage them all without risking civilian areas nearby. Russia's electronic warfare units tried to jam control signals, but the OSA drones relied on internal guidance systems, keeping their course even in heavy interference. This ability has been confirmed by military analysts following Ukraine's rapid adoption of drone AI. At 1935, Russian guns on the shoreline opened fire. Tracers lit the sky and one drone was hit and exploded against the cliffs. But the others kept going. Within seconds, 4 drones locked onto the sanatorium. They released their small-shaped charges, sending warheads diving at over 200 miles per hour. The explosions shook the compound. Fire spread from the kitchen into the western walls, and a luxury car garage burst into flames. Moscow admitted 3 deaths and more than 15 injuries. Satellite images reviewed later showed heavy fire damage in parts of the building, though the exact structural loss remains debated. Information war started immediately. Russian officials described the attack as minor and claimed defenses worked. Ukrainian sources highlighted video clips showing fire inside the complex and argued the strike exposed weak points. Analysts note that both sides are shaping narratives, but the fact remains that Russia admitted casualties in a place meant to symbolize elite safety. The night proved that Russia's expensive air defenses could be tricked and drained by cheap drones. What worked was the quick detection of decoys and the downing of at least one drone by gunfire. What failed was coordination. Missiles hit false targets, radar lost track of low-flying threats, and electronic warfare could not shut down the swarm. The immediate tactical outcome was more than a local fire. It carried strategic weight, raising questions about control of the Black Sea and the future of Ukraine's grain routes. The strike on Foros was more than a local fire. It tied directly to the larger struggle for control of the Black Sea. Crimea is not only a symbol of Russian rule, but also a military platform that allows Moscow to threaten Ukrainian ports and shipping lanes. Ukraine's economy depends heavily on grain exports, and over half of that grain moves through the Black Sea corridor. When Russian forces block or delay this traffic, food prices rise worldwide and Kyiv loses critical revenue. After the drone raids of 2023 and 2024, Russia pulled parts of its Black Sea fleet eastward, away from Sevastopol, to reduce the risk of strikes. Analysts noted that warships began to operate further from Ukraine's coast, and patrols shifted in pattern. This gave Kyiv room to test new routes for grain exports. By early 2024, Ukrainian officials reported cargo ships using a corridor along the western Black Sea, bypassing Russian blockades. Each successful strike on Crimean infrastructure made that path safer. The Foros attack followed the same logic. Hitting a site tied to Moscow's elite may look symbolic, but it forced Russia to reconsider how to allocate air defense systems. Every Pantsir battery or Su-30 sortie used to protect resorts is a unit not guarding naval bases or oil depots. Shifting defense resources weakens the overall shield around Sevastopol, which remains the key port for Russia's fleet. In practice, this means more gaps in coverage and more chances for Ukraine to keep shipping lanes open. The economics of the exchange are striking. A single FPV drone costs perhaps $500 to $2,000, depending on its build. By contrast, an interceptor missile from an S-400 system can cost well over $1 million. Forcing Russia to launch these missiles against swarms of cheap drones drains its stockpile and stretches its supply chain. Each false radar return created by chaff can burn through another missile, meaning millions wasted in seconds. For Ukraine, this cost gap is a weapon in itself, allowing Kyiv to trade small sums for large political and financial damage. Western support has been central in sustaining this pressure. The US and European partners have supplied Ukraine with navigation tools, secure communication links, and funding for drone production. Open reporting shows Kyiv plans to produce or buy more than 1 million drones in 2025, scaling up to match Russia's massive advantage in artillery. That industrial effort is designed not only for frontline strikes but also for strategic attacks that keep the Black Sea corridor alive. For Washington and Brussels, protecting Ukraine's grain exports also means protecting global food stability, since much of that grain feeds Africa and the Middle East. The Foros incident, therefore, fits into a pattern of economic warfare layered over military conflict. Each strike on Crimea widens Ukraine's breathing space and forces Moscow to pay more for defense than for offense. It shows that the side with fewer ships and planes can still tilt the balance by exploiting cost asymmetry and by making Russia defend too many points at once. Beyond strategy and economics, the Foros strike carried a deep psychological weight, shaping how Russians and Ukrainians saw the war and how outside powers judged the balance of resolve. The strike on Foros did not only burn walls and cars. It shook confidence inside Russia and created a story that reached far beyond Crimea. For Moscow's leaders, the idea that an elite retreat could be hit so hard was humiliating. They had promised that Crimea was forever Russian, a safe haven under heavy defense. Seeing smoke rise from a place linked with government circles damaged that claim. Even Russian commentators admitted online that defenses failed, and the images of fire spread quickly despite state media trying to control the story. For the Russian public, the effect was double. Some ordinary citizens grew frustrated that expensive weapons could not stop drones that cost a fraction of a missile. Others feared that if luxury resorts were not safe, then cities deeper inside Russia might also be vulnerable. The gap between the elite's promises of security and the reality on the ground created distrust. Each admitted casualty, even the 3 deaths in Foros, cut into the image of total control that the Kremlin wanted to project. For Ukraine, the event became a morale boost. In Odessa, the bunker operators who guided drones through interference became heroes in local media. Their calm voices and steady control against heavy odds fit the wider narrative of Ukraine as clever, resilient, and unbroken. The image of a technician wiping sweat from his hands while keeping a tiny drone steady turned into a symbol of how human skill could outmatch wealth and hardware. Kyiv used the strike to show that the war is not only about numbers of tanks or missiles, but about creative tactics and resolve. The Foros strike was limited in scale but powerful in meaning. A single evening produced only 3 confirmed deaths and about 16 injuries, yet the images of fire in a resort tied to Moscow's elite carried far greater weight. The attack showed that modern conflict is not only about tanks or missiles, but also about cheap, networked tools that create dilemmas for billion-dollar defenses. For Ukraine, a handful of drones turned into leverage over Russia's most guarded territory. For Moscow, the promise of invulnerability in Crimea cracked before its own citizens. The question now is simple but sharp. Who controls the night sky over the Black Sea when swarms that cost thousands can drain weapons that cost millions? The answer will shape the next stage of this war. Stay with us for more frontline analysis, and don't forget to subscribe to Military Force for our next report.